Hello everyone. Today I am bringing you 9 of the most disturbing true horror stories ever to emerge from the scorched deserts and haunted mountains of Arizona. In this episode, we will journey through the darkest corners of the Grand Canyon State, from abandoned mining towns where the dead refuse to rest, to isolated desert roads where things that should not exist still walk beneath the stars, to places where evil left its mark so deep that time itself cannot erase it. Each account has been meticulously researched and reconstructed from first-hand testimonies, police reports, historical records, and witness statements of those who survived to share their terror. To protect the identities of the victims and their families, certain names and minor details have been changed, but the core events remain exactly as they were reported. These are not legends. These are not myths. These are real experiences that happen to real people in real places you can visit today. I grew up in Jerome, Arizona, perched precariously on Cleopatra Hill in the Verde Valley at an elevation of 5,200 feet. We are probably most famous for being called America's most haunted ghost town. Though with less than 500 people living here year-round, the ghost part feels more literal than anyone wants to admit. The entire town is built on a 30-degree slope, and when you stand on Main Street and look down, you can see the skeletal remains of the old mining operation sprawling across the hillside like the bones of some massive dead creature. Jerome was once known as the wickedest town in the West, and between 1876 and 1953, the United Verde mine produced over $1 billion worth of copper, gold, and silver. But it also produced something else. It produced death, lots of it. Mining accidents claimed hundreds of lives over the decades, and the town itself was nearly destroyed twice by fires that swept through the wooden structures, like the wrath of an angry god. The Jerome Grand Hotel sits at the very top of the town, a massive white concrete structure that dominates the skyline. But it was not always a hotel. From 1927 until 1950, it was the United Verde Hospital, built to treat the endless stream of injured and dying miners who were pulled from the tunnels below. The hospital had 5 floors, and the basement level housed the morgue where bodies were kept before burial. On January 17, 1935, a maintenance man named Claude Harvey was working on the elevator shaft when something went wrong. The elevator came down while he was still inside the shaft, and it crushed him to death. His body was found hours later, mangled almost beyond recognition. They say his blood stained the concrete so deeply that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully remove it. When the hospital finally closed in 1950 and sat abandoned for decades, people started reporting strange things. Elevator doors opening and closing on their own, the sound of footsteps in empty hallways, the smell of copper and blood in the basement, and most disturbing of all, the figure of a man in work clothes seen inside the elevator shaft, always looking like he was searching for something he had lost. My mother worked as a housekeeper at the Jerome Grand Hotel when I was growing up, after it was converted into a hotel in 1996. She had her own experiences with what she called the hotel's residents, though she never liked to talk about them in detail. But there was one rule she was absolutely firm about, and she made me promise to follow it if I ever ended up working there. Never go down to the old basement morgue alone, especially at night. She never told me why exactly. She just said that Claude Harvey was still looking for something down there, and if you disturbed him, he might decide to follow you home to keep looking. I thought it was just a story she told to keep me from sneaking around the hotel when I visited her at work. I wish I'd listened. When I turned 17, I needed a job to save money for college. The Jerome Grand Hotel was hiring servers and bartenders for their restaurant, and my mother helped me get an interview. I started working there in the summer of 2009, mostly working evening shifts serving tourists who came up the mountain to experience the haunted hotel and enjoy the view of the Verde Valley stretching out below. The job was fine at first. Tourists loved hearing the ghost stories, and I became good at telling them. I would describe Claude Harvey's death in gruesome detail and talk about the other spirits that supposedly haunted the building. The woman in white seen on the 3rd floor. The phantom sounds of surgery coming from rooms that had once been operating theaters. The child's laughter that echoed through the hallways late at night, even though no children were staying in the hotel. I told these stories 100 times, and I never believed any of them. They were just entertainment, a way to get bigger tips from thrill-seeking tourists who wanted to feel scared in a safe, controlled environment. But the longer I worked there, the more things started to happen that I could not explain away. Keys would be in locks that I knew I had not touched. I would hear footsteps behind me in empty hallways, and when I turned around, no one would be there. The elevator would malfunction constantly, stopping between floors for no reason, or opening its doors when no one had called it. Other staff members talked about their experiences openly, treating them like just another quirk of working in an old building. My coworker Kendricks, who had worked there for 3 years, told me she saw shadowy figures at least once a week. She said the activity was strongest in the basement, where the old morgue was located. That was where they used to prepare the bodies of dead miners before sending them to their families. That was where Claude Harvey's blood had soaked into the floor. That was where my mother told me to never go alone. I managed to avoid the basement for almost 6 months. My duties never required me to go down there, and I was perfectly happy to keep it that way. But in December of that year, everything changed. It was a slow Tuesday night, and we had just finished cleaning up after the last dinner service. Kendricks and I were the only staff members left in the building, aside from the night manager, who was in the office doing paperwork. Kendricks looked at me with a mischievous grin and said she wanted to show me something in the basement. She said there was a room down there that still had old medical equipment in it, stuff that had been left behind when the hospital closed. She said it was creepy as hell, and she thought I would appreciate it since I was always telling ghost stories to the tourists. I hesitated. I thought about my mother's warning. But Kendricks laughed and called me chicken, and I was 17 and stupid and did not want to look scared in front of my coworker, so I agreed to go. We took the elevator down to the basement level. The doors opened with a groan of metal on metal, and immediately the temperature dropped at least 10 degrees. The basement hallways were not renovated like the upper floors. They still had the original industrial paint on the walls, faded and peeling. The lighting was poor, just a few bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling every 20 feet or so, creating long shadows between each pool of yellow light. The smell hit me immediately. Copper and mold and something else underneath it all, something rotten and old. Kendricks led me down the hallway, past several locked doors, until we reached a room at the very end. She pushed open the door, and inside I could see old gurneys, rusted metal cabinets, and what looked like an ancient embalming table pushed against one wall. "This is where they prepared the bodies," Kendrick said quietly. "This is where Claude Harvey ended up after they pulled him out of the elevator shaft." I stared at the embalming table and felt my stomach turn. The metal surface was stained with dark patches that could have been rust, but somehow I knew they were not. We spent maybe 5 minutes in that room before Kendricks's radio crackled to life. It was the night manager asking her to come back upstairs to help with something. She told me she had to go, and she would be right back. She told me to wait there, or explore a little if I wanted. Then she left, and I heard her footsteps echoing down the hallway, growing fainter and fainter until the basement was completely silent. I should have left with her. I should have followed her right back to the elevator and never looked back. But I did not. Instead, I walked further into the room and started looking at the old medical equipment. There were glass jars on one shelf that still had labels on them, handwritten in faded ink. Formaldehyde, phenol, alcohol. I was reading the labels when I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway. Slow, heavy footsteps coming toward the room. I froze. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I turned around slowly, and I saw him standing in the doorway. A man in work clothes. Dark pants and a dark shirt, both stained with something that looked wet in the dim light. His face was shadowed, but I could see that he was looking directly at me. Not at the room, not at the equipment, at me. I opened my mouth to say something, but no sound came out. The figure took one step into the room, and that is when I saw his hands. They were mangled, the fingers bent at wrong angles, the skin torn and hanging in strips. Exactly the kind of injuries you would get if an elevator crushed you to death. I ran. I pushed past him, or through him, I'm still not sure which, and I felt a cold so intense it burned my skin. I ran down that hallway faster than I have ever run in my life, and I did not stop until I was back in the elevator, slamming my hand on the button to take me back upstairs. The doors closed, and as the elevator rose, I looked down through the gap and saw him standing at the end of the hallway watching me go. When I got back upstairs, Kendricks asked me why I looked so pale. I told her I did not feel well and needed to go home. I left my shift early that night, and I drove the 45 miles back to my family's house in Cottonwood with my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. That should have been the end of it, but it was not. 3 days later, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. Slow, heavy footsteps. I lived in a single-story house, and my bedroom was at the end of a long hallway. The footsteps went back and forth, like someone pacing, like someone searching. I got out of bed and opened my door, and the hallway was empty. But I could smell it, copper and rot, the smell from the basement. It happened again the next night, and the night after that. My mother noticed I was not sleeping well, and when I finally told her what happened in the basement of the Jerome Grand Hotel, her face went white. She told me I had disturbed Claude Harvey. She told me he followed people sometimes when they went down to his domain and interrupted his search. She asked me if I had touched anything in that room. I told her I had picked up one of the glass jars to read the label. She closed her eyes and shook her head. "You took his attention," she said. "Now he thinks you can help him find what he lost." The activity in my house escalated over the next 2 weeks. Objects would move on their own. I would hear breathing behind me when no one was there. My younger brother started having nightmares about a man with broken hands standing at the foot of his bed. My mother finally called someone she knew, a woman from Sedona who specialized in spiritual cleansing. The woman came to our house and performed a ritual that involved burning sage and speaking words in a language I did not recognize. She told us that the spirit was tied to an object, something it had lost in death, and was desperately trying to recover. She said the only way to make it stop was to go back to where it died and help it find peace. My mother refused to let me go back to Jerome, but the activity continued, and it was getting worse. Finally, 3 weeks after my experience in the basement, I drove back to Jerome by myself. I went to the hotel and found the night manager. I told him I needed to go back down to the basement one more time. He looked at me strangely, but gave me the key. I went back down to that room at the end of the hallway, the embalming room, and I stood there in the dim light, and I spoke out loud. I told Claude Harvey that I was sorry for disturbing him. I told him that I did not know what he was looking for, but that I hoped he found peace. I stood there for almost 10 minutes in complete silence, and then, on the floor near the embalming table, I saw something I had not noticed before, a small metal object half hidden under the table. I picked it up. It was a wedding ring, tarnished and bent. Engraved on the inside were the initials CH and a date, June 5th, 1934. Less than a year before, Claude Harvey died in the elevator shaft. I placed the ring on top of the embalming table in plain view, and I left. The activity in my house stopped that night, completely. I never experienced anything paranormal in my home again. But I also never went back to the Jerome Grand Hotel. I quit my job the next day over the phone. My mother understood. Years later, I learned that maintenance workers at the hotel had found a wedding ring in the old morgue during renovations. They had put it in a display case in the hotel lobby, labeled as an artifact from the hospital era. Claude Harvey had finally found what he was looking for, but it took me bringing it out of the shadows for him to see it. I think about that sometimes, about what it means to be so attached to something that you cannot leave, even in death, about what it means to search for decades for something that was right there all along, just hidden in the darkness. Jerome is still called the most haunted town in America, and the Jerome Grand Hotel still offers ghost tours to curious tourists. But I will never go back. Some places hold on to their dead too tightly, and some of the dead hold on right back. The worst shift of my career happened on a Tuesday night in October 1978, and it happened at Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence, where over 100 executions have taken place since 1910. Florence is a small town about 60 miles southeast of Phoenix, surrounded by nothing but desert, cotton fields, and correctional facilities. The town has a population of around 25,000 people, and almost half of them work in the prison system in some capacity. It is the kind of place where the local high school football team plays on Friday nights and everyone goes to church on Sunday mornings. But underneath that small town normalcy sits one of the most notorious prisons in the American Southwest. The death row unit at Florence has housed some of the most dangerous criminals in Arizona history, and I spent 5 years of my life working as a corrections officer in that facility. I thought I had seen everything a human being could do to another human being. I was wrong. I started working at Florence in 1974, right after I got out of the Army. I was 23 years old and needed a job that paid decent money, and corrections work fit the bill. The pay was not great, but it was steady, and there were always openings because the turnover rate was high. Most people could not handle the psychological weight of working in a place where men sat in cells waiting to die, where violence was always just one wrong word away from erupting, where the air itself felt heavy with rage and despair. But I adjusted to it. I learned to keep my face neutral, my voice calm, my movements deliberate. I learned which inmates to watch carefully and which ones would never cause problems. I learned the rhythms of the prison, the routines that kept everything running smoothly. And I learned to leave work at work, to not bring the darkness home with me at the end of each shift. For 4 years, that system worked. And then I met Dion. Dion arrived on death row in August of 1978. He had been convicted of murdering a convenience store clerk during a robbery in Phoenix. The clerk had been a 22-year-old college student working the night shift to pay for his tuition, and he had been shot 3 times in the chest at close range. The case had been all over the news because of how brutal and senseless it was. The prosecution argued that Dion had shot the clerk even after he had already handed over all the money in the register, that it had been an execution-style killing motivated by nothing but cruelty. Dion was sentenced to death by lethal injection, and he was transferred to Florence to await his execution date. When he arrived, I was assigned to his cell block as one of the primary guards. I remember the first time I saw him. He was a big man, over 6 feet tall, with arms covered in prison tattoos and a face that looked like it had seen too much violence for someone only 28 years old. But what struck me most was his eyes. They were not the eyes of a cold-blooded killer. They were the eyes of someone who was terrified. Over the next 2 months, I interacted with Dion almost every day. I brought him his meals. I escorted him to the shower. I supervised his 1 hour of recreation time in the yard, and during those interactions, he talked to me. He told me he was innocent. He told me he had not killed that college student. He told me the police had arrested the wrong man, and that the real killer was still out there walking free. I had heard this before. Every inmate on death row claims they are innocent. It is part of the survival mechanism, the psychological defense against accepting the reality of what they have done and what is going to happen to them. So I did not believe him. I nodded and listened because that was part of my job, but I did not believe a word he said. But Dayon was persistent. He had details. He told me the real killer was someone who knew the convenience store layout, someone who had cased it multiple times before. He told me there had been a witness who saw a different man running from the scene, but that witness had never been called to testify. He told me his own public defender had done almost nothing to investigate his case, had barely put up a defense at all. He told me there was evidence that had never been examined. And most disturbing of all, he told me he thought one of the corrections officers at Florence knew the truth. He would not tell me which one. He just said that someone inside the system was making sure the truth stayed buried. I still did not believe him. But something about the way he talked started to bother me. There was a specificity to his claims that was different from the usual desperate denials I heard from other inmates. And there was something else too. Dayon was calm. Most death row inmates were either angry or broken, cycling between rage and despair as their execution dates approached. But Dayon was calm and focused, like a man who was putting all his energy into solving a problem rather than accepting his fate. It unsettled me in a way I could not quite explain. My coworker Kaylin noticed it too. She had been working at Florence for 7 years, longer than anyone else on our shift, and she had developed an instinct for reading inmates. She told me one night during our dinner break that Dayon was different. She said most inmates gave up eventually, accepted their fate, and went quiet. But Dayon was getting more active, more insistent. She said it felt like he was building toward something. I asked her what she thought he might do, and she just shook her head. She said she did not know, but that we needed to watch him carefully. She was right. October 17th, 1978, Tuesday night. I clocked in for the evening shift at 6 o'clock and everything seemed normal. The death row unit was quiet. Most inmates were in their cells reading or sleeping. Kaylin and I did our rounds, checking each cell, making sure everything was secure. Dayon was sitting on his bunk writing a letter when I looked through his cell window. He glanced up at me and nodded, and I nodded back. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. At 8:30, Kaylin and I were stationed at the control desk at the end of the cell block. There were 2 other officers on duty that night, both of them doing rounds in other sections of the death row unit. The radio was quiet. Everything was routine. And then at 8:47, the radio crackled to life with 3 words that made my blood go cold. Officer down, D block. Kaylin and I grabbed our equipment and ran. D block was the section of death row that housed the most violent inmates, the ones who had killed other prisoners or attacked guards. It was only 2 corridors away from where we were stationed, but it felt like miles. When we got there, I saw Officer Daniels on the ground bleeding from a head wound. Officer Martinez was slumped against the wall, conscious but dazed, and Dayon's cell door was open, not unlocked. Open. Someone had used a key to open it from the outside. Kaylin immediately called for backup and medical assistance while I checked on Daniels and Martinez. Daniels had been hit from behind with something heavy, possibly a radio or a baton. Martinez said he had been escorting Dayon back from the shower when someone attacked him from the side, someone wearing a corrections officer uniform. By the time he realized what was happening, Dayon was gone and the attacker had disappeared. The entire prison went into immediate lockdown. All inmates were secured in their cells. All corridors were sealed. Every available officer was mobilized to search the facility. We found Dayon 30 minutes later. He was inside the execution chamber, the room where lethal injections were carried out. He was sitting in the chair where condemned prisoners spent their final moments, and he was holding a manila envelope. When we entered the room with weapons drawn, he raised his hand slowly and said he was not armed. He said he needed us to listen to him. He said he had proof. The senior officer on scene ordered him to put down the envelope and get on the ground, but Dayon refused. He said if we took the envelope without looking at what was inside, it would disappear just like all the other evidence had disappeared. He said the person who had helped him escape was the same person who had made sure he was convicted for a murder he did not commit. And then he said the name, Officer Richard Haynes, one of the senior corrections officers at Florence, a man who had been working there for 12 years, a man everyone respected. Dion said Haynes was the one who had killed the college student at the convenience store. He said Haynes had a gambling problem and had been robbing businesses around Phoenix to pay his debts. He said he had proof in the envelope, photographs that someone had finally gotten to him after 2 months of trying. The senior officer told Dion to slide the envelope across the floor. Dion did. I was the one who picked it up. Inside were photographs, Polaroid photographs. They showed a man who looked very similar to Dion entering and leaving the convenience store on the night of the murder. But it was not Dion. The facial features were slightly different. The build was slightly different. And in one photograph, you could clearly see a corrections officer badge clipped to the man's belt, half hidden under his jacket. I looked at the photograph, and then I looked at Dion, and I felt something cold settle into my stomach. The senior officer told me to bring him the envelope. I did. He looked at the photographs and his face went pale. And then everything happened very fast. Dion lunged forward toward the senior officer. Multiple officers opened fire. Dion went down. The senior officer was calling for medical, but I could see from where I was standing that Dion was already dead. He had bled out in less than 2 minutes, there on the floor of the execution chamber, where he was supposed to die anyway in just a few weeks. The investigation that followed was unlike anything I had ever seen. The photographs Dion had been holding were entered into evidence. The witness who had seen a different man running from the convenience store was finally interviewed. Security footage from other businesses Haynes had robbed was examined. Financial records showing his gambling debts were subpoenaed. And piece by piece, the truth came out. Officer Richard Haynes had committed the convenience store murder. He had framed Dion, who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time and fit the general description. Haynes had used his position in law enforcement to manipulate evidence and ensure Dion was convicted. And Haynes had been working at Florence specifically so he could keep an eye on Dion and make sure the truth never came out. But someone else at the prison, another officer who had started to suspect Haynes, had managed to get those photographs to Dion. We never found out who it was. They never came forward. Haynes was arrested at his home the next morning. He was eventually convicted and sentenced to death himself. He was executed at Florence in 1983 in the same chamber where Dion had died. But Dion was already dead. An innocent man had been killed by corrections officers while trying to prove his innocence. The state of Arizona issued a posthumous exoneration, but that meant nothing to Dion or his family. I stayed at Florence for another 2 years after that night, but I was never the same. I could not stop thinking about how close we had come to executing an innocent man through official channels. How if Dion had not forced the confrontation that night, he would have died in that chair and the truth would have died with him. I think about Kaylin sometimes. She quit 3 months after that night. She said she could not work in a place where the system had failed so completely. I think about the officer who got those photographs to Dion, whoever they were. They saved the truth, but they could not save the man. And I think about Dion sitting in that execution chair, holding the proof of his innocence, knowing that even in that moment, he probably would not survive the night. He chose to die exposing the truth rather than die in silence. I do not know if that makes it better or worse. I just know that I see his face sometimes when I close my eyes. And I wonder how many other innocent people are sitting in cells right now, waiting to die for crimes they did not commit. How many other Dions are out there, and whether anyone will believe them before it is too late. Back in 2019, my girlfriend Janae and I were driving from Tucson to Phoenix on Interstate 10 when we decided to take a detour to Casa Grande Mountain just after sunset. We had been dating for about 8 months at that point, and we had developed a habit of exploring weird and supposedly haunted locations around Arizona whenever we had free time. Janae was studying anthropology at the University of Arizona, and she had a particular interest in unexplained phenomena and folklore. She was the kind of person who approached the paranormal with scientific curiosity rather than fear or blind belief. She wanted evidence. She wanted to understand. I was less skeptical than she was, more open to the possibility that some things could not be explained by science alone. But I enjoyed the adventures, and I enjoyed spending time with her. Casa Grande Mountain had been on our list for months. It sits in Pinal County, roughly halfway between Tucson and Phoenix, an isolated peak rising from the flat desert landscape like a giant's fist. The mountain has a long history of strange phenomena, but the most frequently reported is something locals call the black mist. The black mist is exactly what it sounds like. A vapor or fog that appears near the mountain at night, always black or very dark gray, moving in ways that natural fog does not move. According to the stories Janae had collected from online forums and local historical societies, the mist does not drift or dissipate. It flows with purpose, like something alive. People who have encountered it report feeling watched, followed, and in some cases completely engulfed by it. Those who have been surrounded by the mist describe experiencing vivid hallucinations, time distortions, and overwhelming feelings of dread. Some people claim to have lost hours of time with no memory of what happened. Others say they saw things in the mist, shapes and figures that should not exist. The phenomenon has been investigated multiple times by paranormal researchers and even some atmospheric scientists, but no one has ever been able to explain what causes it or why it only appears near Casa Grande Mountain. Janae was convinced there was a rational explanation involving temperature inversions and mineral deposits creating unusual air currents. I was less sure, but we both wanted to see it for ourselves. We exited the interstate around 7:30 in the evening and took the back roads toward the mountain. It was late September, and the desert was still holding on to the brutal heat of summer. Even with the sun setting, the temperature was in the low 90s. We parked at a dirt pullout about half a mile from the base of Casa Grande Mountain and got out of the car. The landscape around us was classic Sonoran desert, all saguaro cacti and creosote bushes, and rocky soil that crunched under our feet. The mountain rose in front of us, dark against the deepening purple sky. Janae had brought her camera, equipment, a good digital camera with night vision capability, and a handheld EMF meter that she had borrowed from a friend who did paranormal investigations as a hobby. I thought the EMF meter was overkill, but Janae insisted. She said if the mist was some kind of atmospheric plasma phenomenon, the meter might pick up electromagnetic fluctuations. We set up our equipment on a flat area with a clear view of the mountain, and we waited. For the first hour, nothing happened. The sun finished setting, and the stars came out, thousands of them visible in the clear desert sky, far from any city lights. We sat on the hood of my car and talked about school and work and future plans. Janae wanted to do graduate research on indigenous folklore and its intersection with unexplained phenomena. I was working as a graphic designer and trying to figure out if it was really what I wanted to do with my life. Normal conversation, normal evening. The desert was full of sound, coyotes calling in the distance, insects buzzing in the brush, the occasional rustle of something small moving through the creosote. It felt peaceful, safe. I remember thinking that we were probably wasting our time, that the black mist was just an urban legend amplified by internet forums and credulous tourists. And then, at 9:15, everything changed. The desert went silent. Completely silent. Every sound cut off at once like someone had flipped a switch. Janae noticed it at the same time I did. She sat up straight and looked around, her hand moving instinctively to the EMF meter. And then we saw it. The mist came from the base of the mountain. It did not form gradually the way fog forms. It simply appeared, a dark mass that looked almost solid in the starlight. And it was black. Not gray, not white, black. like oil smoke or ink in water. It moved toward us with a deliberate flowing motion that made my skin crawl. Janae grabbed her camera and started taking pictures, her scientific curiosity overriding any sense of danger. The EMF meter in her other hand was screaming, the needle pinned all the way to the right, indicating electromagnetic fields far beyond what should exist in the middle of the empty desert. I stood up from the hood of the car, watching the mist approach. It was moving faster than it should, covering ground at a pace that felt wrong, and as it got closer, I could see that it was not uniform. There were darker patches within it, areas of deeper black that moved independently, like shadows within shadows. Janae was still taking pictures, muttering observations under her breath, completely focused on documentation. And then the mist reached her. It flowed around her legs first, rising like water filling a container. Janae stopped talking. She lowered the camera slowly and just stood there, staring at nothing. I called her name. She did not respond. The mist continued to rise, climbing her body, wrapping around her torso, her arms, her neck. I ran toward her and grabbed her arm, trying to pull her away. But the moment I touched the mist, it was on me too. The cold hit me first. It was not the cold of winter air or ice. It was the cold of absence, like all the heat was being pulled out of my body at once. My lungs seized up and I could not breathe. And then I was not standing in the desert anymore. I was somewhere else, somewhere dark and vast and empty. I could not see anything. I could not hear anything. I could not feel the ground under my feet. I was suspended in nothing, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was not alone. There were things in the darkness with me. I could not see them, but I could feel them watching, waiting. And then the visions started. I saw people dying in the desert, not recent deaths, old deaths. I saw Spanish conquistadors stumbling through the heat, their armor cooking them alive, dying of thirst with their tongues black and swollen. I saw Hohokam people fleeing from something I could not see, terror on their faces, falling in the sand and not getting up. I saw miners from the 1800s caught in a flash flood, drowning in muddy water that filled a canyon in seconds. I saw a family in a covered wagon dead from disease, their bodies left to rot because there was no one left alive to bury them. I saw a woman running through the night, looking over her shoulder at something pursuing her. And then I saw her fall, and I saw the thing that caught her. Something that was not human. Something with too many limbs and eyes that reflected light like an animal's. The visions came faster and faster, overlapping, a cascade of death and fear and pain that stretched back centuries. This desert was a graveyard. This mountain was a monument to every person who had died in its shadow. And the black mist was the keeper of their memories, the recorder of their final moments. I understood in that instant that the mist was not a natural phenomenon, and it was not supernatural in the traditional sense. It was something older, something that existed in the spaces between life and death, feeding on trauma, growing stronger with each tragedy that occurred within its territory. I do not know how long I was in that state. It could have been seconds. It could have been hours. Time had no meaning in the darkness, but eventually I felt something solid under my feet again. I heard sound returning, the buzz of insects, the whisper of wind through dry grass. I opened my eyes, and I was on my hands and knees in the dirt next to my car. The mist was gone. The desert was normal again, the stars bright overhead, the mountain a dark silhouette in the distance. I looked around frantically for Janae. She was sitting about 10 feet away, her back against a large rock, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at nothing. I crawled over to her and put my hand on her shoulder. She flinched away from me. I said her name again, and this time she looked at me. Her eyes were wrong. Not physically wrong, but there was something missing from them, some spark or warmth that had always been there before. She stood up without saying anything and walked to the car. I followed her, my legs shaking, barely able to support my weight. We got in the car, and I drove us back to the interstate. Neither of us spoke. The camera and the EMF meter were still lying in the dirt where we had been standing. We left them there. We drove to Phoenix in complete silence. When I dropped Janae off at her apartment, she got out of the car without looking at me. I asked her if she was okay. She said she was fine. I asked her what she saw in the mist. She said she did not want to talk about it. Ever. I told her we should talk about what happened, that we needed to process it together. She told me to go home. I did not hear from her for 3 days. When she finally called me, her voice was flat and distant. She said she needed space. She said what happened at Casa Grande Mountain had changed something for her, and she needed time to figure out what it meant. I tried to convince her to talk to me, to let me help her, but she would not engage. 2 weeks later, she broke up with me over text message. No explanation, no closure. Just a simple statement that she could not be in the relationship anymore. I tried to reach out multiple times after that, but she blocked my number and blocked me on all social media. I drove to her apartment once, but her roommate told me she had moved out and left no forwarding address. I did not understand what happened for a long time. I thought maybe she had seen something in the mist that traumatized her so badly she could not face anyone who had been there with her. I thought maybe she blamed me for suggesting we go to Casa Grande Mountain in the first place, even though it had been her idea. But eventually I realized it was something else. Whatever Janae saw in that darkness, whatever visions the mist showed her, they had fundamentally changed her understanding of reality. She had gone there looking for scientific explanations for unexplained phenomena, and instead she had encountered something that proved some things cannot be explained, cannot be rationalized, cannot be studied and documented and understood, and that knowledge had broken something in her. She could not be with me because I was a reminder of the moment her worldview shattered. I was evidence that the experience had been real and not just a hallucination or a dream. I still have nightmares about the black mist. I still see those visions of death in the desert, centuries of pain and terror compressed into a few minutes of subjective experience. I researched Casa Grande Mountain extensively after that night, looking for any information that might explain what we experienced. I found dozens of reports from other people who had encountered the mist. Many of them described similar visions. Many of them talked about relationships falling apart afterward, about psychological changes they could not reverse, about feeling like they had seen something they were never meant to see. Some of them said they still see the mist sometimes, even when they are nowhere near Casa Grande Mountain, even when they are hundreds of miles away. I have seen it too, just glimpses, a patch of black fog in an alley at night, a shadow moving wrong in my peripheral vision. I do not know if it is real or if my mind is creating it, replaying the trauma over and over. But I know that I will never go back to Casa Grande Mountain. I know that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, and I know that Janae is out there somewhere, carrying the same burden I carry, seeing the same things I see, and choosing to face it alone rather than share it with someone who understands. I hope she has found peace. I hope the mist has let her go. But I do not think it works that way. I think once it touches you, once it shows you what it keeps in the darkness, you belong to it forever. You become part of its collection. Another memory, another ghost in the desert. In 2015, 3 friends and I decided to explore the abandoned Vulture gold mine outside Wickenburg, Arizona. By the time we left, only 2 of us were still alive. Wickenburg is a small town about 70 miles northwest of Phoenix, known for its dude ranches and its connection to the Wild West. The Vulture mine opened in 1863 after prospector Henry Wickenburg discovered one of the richest gold deposits in Arizona territory. Over the next 80 years, the mine produced nearly 340,000 ounces of gold and an equal amount of silver, making it one of the most profitable mining operations in the Southwest. But the Vulture mine also has a dark history. During its operational years, at least 18 men were hanged from a large ironwood tree near the main shaft, accused of high grading, which means stealing ore from the mine. The tree became known as the Hanging Tree, and it still stands today, twisted and dead, a monument to frontier justice and the violence that defined the Old West. The mine closed permanently in 1942, and since then it has become one of Arizona's most notorious abandoned locations, attracting urban explorers, paranormal investigators, and thrill seekers. We were all three. There were 4 of us that day. Me, my best friend Jaslyn, and 2 other friends from college, Indiana and Talon. We had been exploring abandoned buildings and ghost towns around Arizona for about 2 years at that point, documenting our adventures with cameras and drones. We had been to old mining camps in the Superstition Mountains, abandoned homesteads in the desert near Yuma, and even some of the less secure buildings in Jerome. The Vulture Mine had been on our list for months, but we kept putting it off because Talon had become increasingly obsessed with it. He had started talking about the mine constantly, researching its history, studying old maps of the tunnel systems, reading accounts from miners about rich veins of gold that were supposedly never fully extracted. He was convinced there was still gold in the Vulture Mine, hidden in collapsed tunnels or sealed chambers that had been abandoned when the mine shut down. Jaslyn in Indiana thought it was funny at first, calling him our little prospector, joking that he was going to strike it rich. But I noticed that Talon was not joking back. He was serious, obsessed. His eyes would get this intense look whenever he talked about the mine, and he would get angry if anyone suggested that his theories were unrealistic. I should have recognized it as a warning sign. I should have refused to go with him. But I did not. We arrived at the Vulture Mine on a Saturday morning in late October. The site is technically private property, but the fences are old and full of gaps, and the owners had long since given up trying to keep people out. There are warning signs everywhere telling visitors they enter at their own risk, that the mine shafts are unstable and dangerous, that people have died exploring the tunnels. We had seen those signs at every abandoned mine we had ever visited, and we had never had a serious problem before. We parked about half a mile away and hiked in, carrying backpacks with water, flashlights, rope, and basic first aid supplies. The Vulture Mine site is sprawling, covering several acres of desert hillside. There are dozens of buildings in various states of collapse, rusted machinery, half buried in sand, and at least 15 different mine shafts entering the hillside at different elevations. The main shaft is sealed with a metal gate, but many of the smaller exploration tunnels are still accessible if you are willing to squeeze through narrow openings or climb down unstable slopes. We spent the first hour just walking around the surface, taking pictures of the buildings and the hanging tree. The tree is massive and completely dead, its bare branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. There are initials carved into its trunk, hundreds of them, left by visitors over the decades. Talon spent a long time standing under that tree, looking up at the branch where the nooses had hung. He said he could feel the presence of the men who died there. He said their anger was still in the wood. Around noon, we decided to explore one of the smaller tunnels on the eastern side of the site. It was not too deep, maybe 50 feet into the hillside, and the ceiling looked relatively stable. We entered single file, using our flashlights to navigate the uneven floor. The temperature dropped immediately as we moved away from the entrance, and the air smelled like dust and mineral deposits and something organic that had rotted a long time ago. The tunnel branched into 2 passages about 30 feet in. Indiana wanted to explore the left branch, but Talon insisted we go right. He said he had studied the old mine maps, and he knew the right branch led to an area where high-grade ore had been found in the 1890s. We followed him because he seemed so confident. The right branch got narrower as we went deeper, forcing us to walk hunched over. And then Jaslyn, who was behind me, pointed her flashlight at the ground and said we should turn back. There were fresh footprints in the dust, boot prints that were not ours. Someone else had been in this tunnel recently. Very recently. Talon said it was probably just another explorer, and we should keep going. But the footprints only went deeper into the tunnel. They did not come back out. We found the camping gear about 20 feet further in. A sleeping bag, some empty water bottles, granola bar wrappers. Someone had been staying in the mine, living in it. Indiana wanted to leave immediately. Jaslyn agreed. But Talon said we had come this far and we should at least see where the tunnel led. He was getting agitated, defensive. I suggested we compromise, check out the end of the tunnel quickly and then head back to the surface. Everyone agreed. We continued forward, and the tunnel opened up into a larger chamber, maybe 15 feet across. The walls were covered in old tool marks where miners had chipped away the rock. And in the corner of the chamber, there was more evidence of habitation. A lantern, a pile of rags that might have been clothes, and a pickaxe leaning against the wall, its wooden handle worn smooth with use. Talon walked over to the pickaxe and picked it up. He tested its weight, and then he started examining the walls of the chamber, running his hand over the rock, muttering about quartz veins and promising formations. Indiana laughed nervously and said Talon was starting to creep him out. Talon did not respond. He just kept moving around the chamber, touching the walls, swinging the pickaxe experimentally. And then he stopped. He turned to look at us, and his expression was wrong. His eyes were too wide. His mouth was pulled into something that was not quite a smile. He said the mine had told him something. He said the gold was still here, and it needed to be protected from thieves. What happened next happened very fast. Talon raised the pickaxe and swung it at Indiana. Indiana tried to dodge, but the tunnel was too narrow and there was nowhere to go. The pickaxe caught him in the shoulder, and I heard bone break. Indiana screamed and fell against the wall. Jaslyn and I ran. We ran back through the tunnel toward the entrance, our flashlights bouncing wildly, our feet slipping on the loose rock. Behind us, I could hear Talon shouting something about high graders and thieves and the hanging tree. I could hear Indiana screaming for help, and then the screaming stopped. We burst out of the tunnel entrance into the blinding sunlight, and we kept running. We ran across the mine site toward where we had parked the car. But halfway there, Jaslyn grabbed my arm and said we could not leave Indiana. We had to go back. We had to help him. I knew she was right. I also knew that Talon had gone insane and was probably going to kill us if we went back into that tunnel. We crouched behind one of the collapsed buildings and tried to call 911, but there was no cell reception. The vulture mine is too remote. We waited for 20 minutes, hiding behind that building, listening for any sound from the mine. Finally, we saw Talon emerge from the tunnel entrance. He was covered in blood. He was still carrying the pickaxe. He stood there in the sunlight for a moment, looking around, and then he started walking toward the hanging tree. Jaslyn whispered that we needed to get to the car now while he was distracted. We ran. We made it to the car, and I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. We drove out of there at full speed, bouncing over the dirt roads, not stopping until we reached the highway. As soon as we had cell reception, we called 911. The police met us in Wickenburg. We told them everything. They organized a search team and went back to the vulture mine with us. They found Indiana in the tunnel chamber. He had bled out from his wounds. The pickaxe had punctured his lung. They found Talon at the hanging tree. He was sitting at the base of the trunk, covered in dried blood, the pickaxe lying beside him. When the police approached him, he did not resist. He did not say anything. He just stared at them with empty eyes. Later, during the psychiatric evaluation, Talon said he had no memory of attacking Indiana. He said the last thing he remembered was entering the tunnel, and then everything went black until he woke up sitting under the hanging tree with police officers surrounding him. The prosecutor argued that Talon had experienced a psychotic break, triggered by his obsession with finding gold, that he had convinced himself Indiana was trying to steal his discovery and had attacked him in a fit of paranoid rage. The defense argued for temporary insanity. Talon was ultimately convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, and was sentenced to 15 years in a psychiatric facility. But here is what bothers me. Talon had no history of violence, no history of mental illness, no history of anything that would predict what he did that day. And when I gave my statement to the police, I told them about the camping gear we found in the tunnel, evidence that someone else had been living in the mine. They searched extensively, but never found any trace of whoever had been staying there. The sleeping bag and supplies we saw were gone. It was like they had never existed. I have thought about that day constantly for the last 10 years. I have replayed every moment, looking for signs I missed, warnings I should have heeded. And I keep coming back to what Talon said right before he attacked Indiana. He said the mine told him something. He said the gold needed to be protected. The Vulture Mine has a long history of violence and death. 18 men hanged for stealing ore. Dozens more killed in accidents or claim disputes. Hundreds of miners who spent years of their lives underground, breathing dust, breaking their bodies, all in pursuit of gold. That kind of obsession leaves a mark. That kind of violence soaks into the rock. I do not know if I believe in curses or haunted places or spirits that possess the living, but I know that something changed in Talon when we entered that mine. Something woke up in him, or something else took over. And I know that Indiana is dead because of it. Jaslyn moved to Colorado 6 months after the incident. We do not talk anymore. I think being around me reminds her too much of that day. I still live in Arizona, but I will never go back to Wickenburg. I will never explore another abandoned mine, because I learned that some places should stay abandoned, some doors should stay closed, and some obsessions, once awakened, can never be satisfied. The gold is still there in the Vulture Mine, millions of dollars worth, according to some estimates, locked away in collapsed tunnels and sealed chambers. But it is not worth dying for. It is not worth killing for. And it is definitely not worth losing your mind for. I hope Talon finds peace someday. I hope he remembers what happened so he can understand and process it. But part of me thinks it is better that he does not remember. Because what if what he told us was true? What if the mine really did speak to him? What would it have said? I worked at Casey Moore's Oyster House in Tempe, Arizona for 3 years, and everyone who has ever spent a night shift there knows about the woman who was strangled upstairs by her jilted boyfriend back when it was a boarding house in 1910. The building itself sits on the corner of Ash Avenue and 10th Street, just a few blocks from the Arizona State University campus. It is a beautiful old house, 2 stories with a wraparound porch and Victorian-era architecture that looks completely out of place among the modern apartment complexes and college bars that surround it. The house was built in 1910 by a man named Robert Casey and his wife Ada Moore Casey, and it originally served as a boarding house for travelers and workers passing through the area. Tempe was much smaller back then, just a desert town with a normal school that would eventually become Arizona State University. The boarding house did good business for several years, renting rooms to miners, railroad workers, and students. But in 1913, something terrible happened on the 2nd floor that would mark the building forever. The story goes like this. A young woman in her early 20s was renting a room on the 2nd floor while she worked as a seamstress in town. She had come to Arizona from back east, running away from a bad situation with a man who had become obsessively controlling. She thought she had escaped him, that the distance and the desert would keep her safe. But he followed her. He showed up at the boarding house one night demanding to see her, claiming he was her fiancé and they were going to be married. The owner told him to leave, but he came back later, climbed up to the 2nd floor window, and broke into her room. What happened next depends on which version of the story you hear, but they all end the same way. The woman was strangled to death in her room, and her body was not discovered until the next morning. Some versions say the boyfriend killed himself afterward. Others say he fled and was never caught, but everyone agrees that the woman never left the boarding house. Her spirit has been seen in the windows of the second floor for over a century, a pale figure in a white dress, looking out at the street below, still waiting for someone to save her. When I started working at Casey Moore's in 2018, I thought the ghost stories were just marketing. The restaurant plays up its haunted reputation to attract customers, and the servers are encouraged to tell guests about the paranormal activity. Glasses moving on their own, footsteps in empty rooms, doors locking and unlocking without anyone touching them, cold spots, strange sounds, the usual ghost story checklist. But after working there for a few weeks, I started to experience things myself. Nothing dramatic at first, just small things that I could easily explain away. A chair that I had pushed in would be pulled out when I came back. Silverware arranged in patterns I had not created. The feeling of being watched when I was alone in a section of the restaurant. I mentioned it to Dalen, the bar manager who had been working at Casey Moore's for 15 years. He laughed and said I was getting the initiation. He said the spirit was just checking me out, figuring out if I was going to be respectful or if I was going to cause problems. I asked him if he actually believed the place was haunted, and his smile faded. He said he had seen too much over the years to not believe. He told me about the time he was closing up alone and heard a woman crying upstairs. He told me about the glasses that shattered in his hands for no reason. He told me about the night he saw her reflection in the bar mirror standing behind him, and when he turned around, no one was there. I worked at Casey Moore's for almost a year before I saw her myself. It was a Tuesday night in October, slow and quiet. Most of the tables were empty, and I was doing side work in the main dining room, while Dalen was behind the bar talking to the only 2 customers we had. I needed to grab something from the storage area upstairs, which meant going up the narrow staircase to the second floor where the old boarding rooms used to be. The upstairs is not open to customers anymore. It is used for storage and office space, but the original room layout is still visible. Small rooms with high ceilings and old hardwood floors that creak with every step. I had been up there dozens of times during daylight, and it always felt a little off, like the temperature was wrong or the air was too still. But going up there at night was different. The staircase is poorly lit, and the hallway at the top is dark except for a single bulb at the far end. I climbed the stairs and stepped into the hallway, and immediately I felt cold. Not uncomfortable cold, not winter cold, but the cold of walking into a freezer. I could see my breath. I walked down the hallway toward the storage room, and that is when I heard it. Breathing. Slow and labored, like someone struggling to get air, coming from one of the old boarding rooms. I stopped walking. The breathing continued. And then I heard something else, a wet, choking sound, like someone drowning. I should have left. I should have gone back downstairs and told Dalen what I was hearing, but I did not. I walked toward the sound. The door to the room was closed, but not latched. I pushed it open slowly, and the temperature dropped even further. The room was empty. No furniture, no boxes, nothing but bare walls and floorboards. But I could still hear the breathing and the choking, louder now, coming from the corner of the room near the window. And then I saw her. Not clearly. Not like seeing a living person, but a shape. A silhouette darker than the shadows around it. The outline of a woman kneeling on the floor, her hands at her throat, her head tilted back like she was trying to scream but could not make a sound. I watched her for maybe 5 seconds frozen in place, and then the figure collapsed forward and disappeared. The sound stopped. The temperature returned to normal. I stood in that empty room trying to convince myself I had imagined it, but I knew I had not. I went back downstairs and told Dalen what I had seen. He did not seem surprised. He just nodded and said she shows that to people sometimes, replaying her death, making sure no one forgets what happened to her. A few months later, we hired a new server named Kendricks. He was a college student at ASU, working part-time to pay for rent and books. He was skeptical about the ghost stories, the way I had been when I first started. He thought it was all nonsense designed to impress gullible tourists. But Kendricks started having experiences almost immediately, worse experiences than most of the staff reported. Objects would fly off shelves when he walked past. Lights would flicker violently whenever he entered a room. Doors would slam shut in front of him, and he started seeing her constantly. Not just upstairs in the old boarding rooms, but everywhere. At the bottom of the stairs, behind the bar, in the walk-in cooler, standing in corners, always the same figure. A woman in a white dress with dark hair, her hands at her throat, her face pale and desperate. Kendricks became obsessed. He started researching the history of the building, digging through old newspapers and county records. He wanted to know who she was. He wanted to know her name. Most versions of the story do not include names, just the generic tale of a murdered boarding house resident. But Kendricks found her. Her name was Elizabeth Harmon, originally from Pennsylvania. She had been 23 years old when she died, and the man who killed her was named Thomas Ridley, a railroad worker who had followed her from Pittsburgh after she broke off their engagement. Ridley had been questioned by local authorities, but never arrested. He left Arizona a week after the murder and was never seen in the area again. Kendricks became convinced that Elizabeth was trying to communicate something, that her increasing activity was not random harassment, but a deliberate attempt to get attention. He started staying late after his shifts, sitting alone in the upstairs rooms, trying to make contact. Dalen and I both told him it was a bad idea, that he was inviting something he might not be able to control, but Kendricks would not listen. He said Elizabeth deserved justice, that someone needed to help her find peace. 2 weeks after he found Elizabeth's name, the activity escalated dramatically. Every night when Kendricks was working, objects would move violently, glasses would shatter, and the figure of Elizabeth would appear multiple times per shift. She was always doing the same thing, pointing, standing in different locations throughout the building and pointing at the same wall on the second floor, a section of wall in what used to be her room. Kendricks became convinced there was something hidden in that wall, something Elizabeth wanted found. He convinced Dalen to let him open up the wall during scheduled renovations. The restaurant was planning to update some of the upstairs rooms anyway, so Dalen agreed on the condition that Kendricks would be the one to pay for repairs if they found nothing. Kendricks opened up the wall on a Monday afternoon when the restaurant was closed. I was there. Dalen was there, and 2 other staff members who wanted to see what would happen. Kendricks used a hammer to carefully break through the old plaster, revealing the space between the wall studs. At first, there was nothing, just empty space and old insulation. But then Kendricks reached deeper into the cavity and pulled out a metal box. It was rusted and dented, maybe 8 inches long and 4 inches wide. We took it downstairs to the bar and Kendricks pried it open. Inside were letters. Old letters written on yellowed paper in faded ink. Love letters from Thomas Ridley to Elizabeth Harmon, dozens of them, dating from 1898 to 1912. And at the bottom of the box was a folded piece of paper that was different from the others. Newer paper, clearer ink. Kendricks unfolded it carefully, and we read it together. It was a confession, written by Thomas Ridley, dated October 1913, just days after Elizabeth's murder. In the letter, Ridley admitted to killing Elizabeth. He described climbing through her window, confronting her about ending their engagement, and strangling her when she refused to take him back. He wrote that he was leaving Arizona and would never return, that he knew he would never be caught, and that he could not live with what he had done. The letter ended with a request. He asked whoever found it to make sure Elizabeth was remembered, to make sure people knew what happened to her was not an accident or a random act of violence, but murder by someone who claimed to love her. We took the confession to the Tempe Police Department, but there was nothing they could do. The murder was over a century old, and everyone involved was long dead. But the confession was entered into the historical record, and we made copies to display at the restaurant as part of the building's history. Elizabeth Harmon's story was no longer just a vague ghost tale. It was documented, it was real, and most importantly, it was told. After we found the confession and put it on display, the paranormal activity at Casey Moore's changed. It did not stop completely, but it became gentler, less aggressive. Staff still report seeing Elizabeth's figure in the windows upstairs, but she is not frantic anymore. She is just standing there, looking out, peaceful. Doors still open and close on their own sometimes, and there are still cold spots and strange sounds. But it feels different now. It feels like she is not trying to get our attention anymore. Kendricks quit working at the restaurant about a month after we found the confession. He said he had accomplished what he needed to accomplish, and staying there reminded him too much of the intensity of those weeks when Elizabeth was reaching out. I understood. I left Casey Moore's 6 months later when I graduated and moved to California for a new job, but I still think about Elizabeth sometimes, about how she spent over 100 years trying to tell her story, trying to make sure people knew the truth about what happened to her. And I think about how many other victims are out there, forgotten or dismissed, still trying to be heard, still waiting for someone to listen. 20 years ago, my older brother and I were working landscaping jobs around northern Arizona. We were both in our early 20s, trying to save money and figure out what we wanted to do with our lives. After our shift ended around 7 o'clock in the evening, we had a routine. We would drive about 20 miles out into the desert on dirt roads north of Flagstaff to a spot we had discovered between two low hills. It was isolated and private, a place where we could decompress from the day, smoke a little, and just exist away from people and civilization. We had been going to this exact spot 2 or 3 times a week for almost 4 months. We knew the route, we knew the landmarks, we knew the sounds the desert made at night. It felt safe and familiar. And then one night in late August, everything changed. We never went back after that night. Neither of us has set foot in the northern Arizona desert since. The drive out there took about 40 minutes on dirt roads that got progressively rougher the further you went from the highway. My brother always drove because I did not trust myself on those washboard roads in the dark. We would leave town around 7:30, right as the sun was starting to set, and we would arrive at our spot just as full darkness settled in. The location was perfect. It was a flat area of maybe 50 feet across, nestled between 2 hills that were about 30 feet high. The hills concealed us from anyone driving by on the distant roads, and there was a large flat rock that made a perfect bench to sit on. The surrounding desert was classic high-elevation Arizona landscape. Ponderosa pines mixed with juniper trees, rocky soil covered with bunch grass and small shrubs. The air was always cool at night because of the elevation, sometimes dropping into the 50s, even in summer. And the desert at night was loud. Coyotes howled constantly. Owls called back and forth. Small animals rustled through the brush. Insects buzzed and chirped. The wind whispered through the pine trees. It was never silent, ever, until that night. We arrived at our spot around 8:15. The sky was that deep blue-black you only get in the desert far from city lights, and the stars were already visible. My brother parked the truck in the same place we always parked it, facing back the way we had come so we could leave quickly if we needed to. We got out and walked to the flat rock. Everything felt normal. The temperature was comfortable. The sounds of the desert surrounded us. My brother pulled out his supplies and started rolling a joint while I sat next to him looking up at the stars. We were talking about work, about whether we should stay in Flagstaff or move to Phoenix, where there were more opportunities. Normal conversation, normal evening, and then at exactly 8:32, I know the time because I checked my watch, everything stopped. The sound cut off. Not gradually, not fading away. It just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch and muted the entire desert. The coyotes stopped howling mid-call. The insects stopped buzzing. The wind stopped moving through the trees. Complete silence. The kind of silence that is so absolute it becomes a physical presence, pressing against your ears, making you aware of your own heartbeat and breathing. My brother stopped what he was doing and looked up. I could see his face in the moonlight, and his expression was confused. He said something, asked me if I heard that, but his voice sounded wrong, flat and dead, like the air was swallowing the sound before it could travel. I nodded. We both stood up from the rock and looked around. Nothing was moving. The trees were completely still, even though there had been a steady breeze just seconds before. And then I heard it, a sound that did not belong, a high-pitched tone, almost like tinnitus, but external, coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It was not loud, but it was invasive, drilling into my skull, making my teeth ache. My brother heard it too. He put his hands over his ears, but it did not help. The sound was not coming through our ears, it was inside our heads. And then my brother grabbed my arm. His grip was painful, his fingers digging into my skin. He was staring at the top of the hill to our left, the one that was about 30 feet high. I turned to look, and at first I did not see anything, just the dark outline of the hill against the slightly lighter sky. But my brother was frozen, his whole body rigid, his breathing fast and shallow. I asked him what he saw. He did not answer. He just pulled me toward the truck. We moved fast, not quite running, but close. My brother kept looking over his shoulder at the hill, and I kept asking him what was wrong, what he saw. He would not answer. He just kept pulling me toward the truck. We got in, and he started the engine, and I have never seen him drive so recklessly in my life. He tore out of there at full speed, the truck bouncing and sliding on the rough dirt road, kicking up massive clouds of dust. I was gripping the door handle with one hand and bracing myself against the dashboard with the other, sure we were going to flip or hit a tree. The high-pitched sound faded as we got further from the spot, and after about 2 miles, the normal desert sounds returned. Coyotes, insects, wind, like nothing had happened. My brother did not slow down until we reached the paved highway, and even then he was doing 20 miles over the speed limit all the way back to Flagstaff. I kept asking him what happened, what he saw on that hill. He would not talk. He just drove, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles standing out. We got back to our apartment around 9:30. My brother went straight to his room and closed the door. I sat in the living room, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand why we had left so fast. Around midnight, I knocked on his door. He told me to come in. He was sitting on his bed with all the lights on, and he looked pale and shaken in a way I had never seen before. I sat down and I told him he needed to tell me what he saw. He was quiet for a long time, and then he started talking. He said when the silence hit, he felt like something was watching us. He said it was the same feeling you get when you're alone in the woods and you suddenly realize a predator is nearby. That prey instinct that humans still have buried deep in our DNA. And then he saw it on top of the hill. He said it was standing completely still, looking down at us. He said it was massive, at least 9 feet tall, maybe taller. The body shape was humanoid, but wrong. The proportions were off. The arms were too long. The head was too large, and it was just standing there, silhouetted against the sky, watching us. He said he knew with absolute certainty that if we did not leave immediately, something terrible was going to happen. He said he could feel its attention on us, heavy and malicious, like it was deciding whether to come down from that hill or not. I asked him if he thought it was a person. He looked at me like I was insane. He said no person is 9 feet tall. No person can make the entire desert go silent just by being present. No person radiates that kind of wrongness. I asked him if he thought it was a bear standing on its hind legs. He said he knows what a bear looks like, and this was not a bear. The shape was wrong. The way it stood was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. I suggested maybe it was a trick of the light, shadows creating an illusion. He just shook his head. He said he looked at it for at least 10 seconds, long enough to be sure of what he was seeing. Long enough to see it shift its weight slightly, proving it was not a tree or a rock formation. long enough to see it turn its head to track our movement as we backed toward the truck. I did not know what to say. My brother is not someone who scares easily. He is not someone who believes in paranormal or supernatural things. He is practical and skeptical and level-headed. But that night, he was genuinely terrified. And his fear made me terrified too, because if he saw something that could break through his skepticism that completely, then it must have been real. We did not sleep that night. We stayed up talking, trying to make sense of it. The next morning, my brother said he wanted to go back in daylight to see if there was any evidence. I thought it was a terrible idea, but I agreed to go with him because I did not want him going alone. We drove out there around noon, and in the daylight the place looked completely normal. Just another patch of desert between two hills. We walked around looking for footprints or tracks or anything that would explain what my brother saw, and we found them. On top of the hill, where the figure had been standing, there were impressions in the dirt, not human footprints, not animal prints that I could recognize. They were roughly foot-shaped but elongated, at least 18 inches long and 6 inches wide at the widest point, and they were deep, pressed into the hard-packed dirt like whatever made them was extremely heavy. There were only 3 of them, like whatever it was had taken 3 steps to the edge of the hill and then stopped. The stride length between the prints was over 6 feet. No human has a stride that long. We took pictures with my brother's camera, and then we left. We did not go back to that spot. We did not go back to any isolated spot in the desert. Within a month, my brother had moved to California. He said he could not stay in Arizona anymore. He said every time he looked at the mountains or the tree line, he wondered if it was out there watching him. I stayed in Flagstaff for another year, but I never felt comfortable in the desert again. I researched what we might have seen. I found stories about the Mogollon monster, Arizona's version of Bigfoot, a creature said to inhabit the pine forests along the Mogollon Rim. The descriptions match what my brother saw: 7 to 9 feet tall, humanoid but with wrong proportions, covered in dark hair. But the Mogollon monster is supposed to be an ape-like creature, and my brother never mentioned hair. He just described the silhouette, the shape, and none of the Mogollon monster stories mention the silence. That absolute dead silence that preceded the sighting. That felt like something else, something worse. I talked to a few people who work in forestry and wildlife management, asking if there are any known animals that could cause that kind of reaction in the local fauna. They said no. They said the only time the desert goes completely silent is right before a major predator appears, like a mountain lion or a bear, and even then it is only the immediate area that goes quiet, not the entire landscape for miles. What we experienced was not natural. I do not know what it was. I do not know if it was a cryptid or something supernatural or something that science has not discovered yet, but I know that it was real. I know that my brother saw it. I know that it was watching us. And I know that we got out of there just in time. Sometimes I still dream about that night, about the silence and the high-pitched tone and the feeling of being watched by something that should not exist. And I wonder how many other people have seen it. How many other people have encountered that thing in the northern Arizona desert and either did not survive to tell the story, or survived but decided never to speak about it. Because that is the thing about the desert. It is vast and empty and full of places where things can hide. And just because we do not see them does not mean they are not there. My best friend Jalen disappeared on Route 66 near the abandoned town of Two Guns in March 2021. The police called it a missing person case, but I know the curse took her. Two Guns is located in Coconino County, about 30 miles east of Flagstaff, sitting on the edge of Canyon Diablo. The town has a history that goes back to the late 1800s, but its roots go even deeper into tragedy. In 1878, a band of Navajo warriors attacked a group of Apache who were camped in a cave system near the canyon. The Navajos sealed the cave entrance and set fires, suffocating and burning alive everyone inside. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 40 and 60 Apache died in that cave, their bodies left to rot in the darkness. Decades later, in the 1920s, an entrepreneur named Harry Miller built a tourist attraction on top of the massacre site. He opened up the cave, displayed the bones and skulls of the dead Apache as roadside attraction decoration, and charged people 50 cents to walk through and gawk at human remains. He called it the Mystery Cave. Route 66 travelers in the 20s and 30s would stop at Two Guns to see the death cave, get gas, and buy souvenirs made from the bones of murder victims. The curse of Two Guns is well documented. Nothing has ever succeeded in that location. Harry Miller's business failed within a few years. The trading post burned down in 1930. It was rebuilt and burned down again in 1938. Another business opened in 1951 and failed within 2 years. A zoo was established in 1963 featuring caged mountain lions and bobcats, and it closed after the owner was mauled to death by one of his own animals. Every single business venture at Two Guns has ended in failure, fire, bankruptcy, or death. The town was finally abandoned completely in the 1970s, and now all that remains are crumbling buildings, rusted cars, collapsed structures, and the cave where the Apache died. Route 66 still runs right past it, and you can pull off and explore the ruins if you want, but locals will tell you not to. They will tell you the place is cursed. They will tell you that bad things happen to people who disturb the site. And they are right. Jalen and I had been best friends since middle school. We met in 8th grade and bonded over our shared love of abandoned places and forgotten history. By the time we were in our mid-20s, we had explored dozens of ghost towns, abandoned mines, and historical sites across Arizona and New Mexico. Jalen was the researcher. She would spend weeks reading about a location before we visited, learning its history, finding old photographs, mapping out the safest routes to explore. I was the photographer. I documented everything we saw, creating a visual record of places that were slowly disappearing. We talked about publishing a book someday, a collection of Arizonas, abandoned places with history and photographs. Two Guns had been on our list for years, but I always resisted going there. I'd read the stories. I'd read about the curse and the pattern of death and failure that followed anyone who tried to profit from or disturb the massacre site. Jalen thought it was superstition. She said curses were not real, that the pattern of failure was just bad luck and poor business decisions amplified by confirmation bias. She said we were not going there to profit or exploit. We were going to document and remember. She said that made us different. I wish I had argued harder. I wish I had refused to go. We left Flagstaff on a Saturday morning in early March. The weather was clear and cold, typical for northern Arizona in late winter. We took Interstate 40 east toward Winslow, and just past the Meteor Crater exit, we took the old Route 66 access road that runs parallel to the interstate. Two Guns is not hard to find. The ruins are visible from the highway, a cluster of collapsed stone buildings and rusted metal sitting at the edge of the canyon. We parked on the side of the road and got out. The site is technically private property, but like most abandoned locations in Arizona, the fences are long gone, and no one actively prevents access. There are signs warning about dangerous structures and telling visitors they enter at their own risk. We had seen those signs 100 times before at other locations. We ignored them. The main ruins consist of several buildings in various states of collapse. The old gas station with its roof caved in. The trading post with walls still partially standing. The remains of the zoo cages, empty and rusting. And at the far end of the site, hidden behind a chain-link fence covered in warning signs, the entrance to the cave, the death cave, the massacre site. Jalen wanted to see it. I told her it was a bad idea. The signs specifically warned against entering the cave system, citing unstable rock, hidden drops, and mountain lion dens. But Jalen said, We had come all this way, and she just wanted to look inside. Just a quick look. We walked to the cave entrance. The chain-link fence was old and bent, easy to climb over. The warning signs were faded but still readable. Danger, keep out, mountain lions, unstable rock. We ignored them. The cave entrance was a natural opening in the canyon wall, about 6 feet high and 4 feet wide. We turned on our flashlights and stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately. The cave system was larger than I expected, with the main chamber opening up to maybe 20 feet across. The floor was uneven, covered in rocks and debris and bones. There were still bones, not displayed like they had been in Harry Miller's tourist trap, but scattered and broken, half buried in dirt and animal droppings. Human remains that no one had ever properly buried or removed. Jalen started taking notes and measurements, documenting the layout of the cave. I took photographs, trying to capture the horror of what this place represented. We were about 15 minutes into exploring when Jalen noticed a secondary passage branching off from the main chamber. It was narrow, barely wide enough for one person to squeeze through. She wanted to see where it led. I told her we should go back. I told her we had seen enough, but she was already moving toward the passage, her flashlight illuminating the narrow opening. I followed her because I did not want her going alone. The passage was tight and claustrophobic, forcing us to turn sideways and shuffle along. It went back about 30 feet before opening into another chamber, smaller than the first, maybe 10 feet across. And this chamber felt wrong. I cannot explain it better than that. It just felt wrong. The air was colder, the darkness seemed thicker, and there was a smell, something rotten and ancient, that made my stomach turn. Jalen stood in the center of the chamber, shining her flashlight around the walls. She said something about pictographs, ancient drawings on the rock. I was not looking at the walls. I was looking at Jalen, because her face had changed. Her expression had gone slack and distant, like she was not fully present anymore. I called her name. She did not respond. I reached out to touch her shoulder, and she flinched away from me like I had burned her. Then she turned and looked at me, and her eyes were wrong. Not physically wrong, but empty, like she was looking through me rather than at me. And then she whispered something I could not understand, words in a language I did not recognize. I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the passage opening, telling her we needed to leave right now. She resisted at first, pulling against me, trying to stay in that wrong chamber. But I dragged her back through the narrow passage and out into the main cave. Once we were back in the larger chamber, Jalen seemed to come back to herself. She looked confused, asking me why I was so upset, saying she was fine. I told her what had happened, how she had zoned out, and started speaking in another language. She said she did not remember any of that. She remembered entering the small chamber and looking at the walls, and then the next thing she knew, I was pulling her back through the passage. We left the cave immediately. I was shaking by the time we got back outside into the sunlight. Jalen seemed normal again, like nothing had happened. She said I was overreacting, that she had probably just gotten disoriented in the tight space and low oxygen. She said we should keep exploring the ruins. I refused. I told her we were leaving. She got angry, said I was being ridiculous, said we had driven all the way out there and she wanted to finish documenting the site. We argued. It was the worst fight we had ever had. Eventually, Jalen said, fine, she would explore on her own, and I could wait by the car if I was too scared. She walked back toward the ruins. I did not follow her. I went back to my car and sat in the driver's seat with the doors locked, watching her move through the collapsed buildings with her camera. 20 minutes passed, then 30. I could see Jalen moving around the site, taking pictures, making notes. She was near the old zoo cages. Then she moved behind one of the larger ruins and I lost sight of her. I waited for her to reappear on the other side. She did not. 5 minutes went by. 10 minutes. I got out of the car and called her name. No response. I walked back into the ruins, retracing the path I'd seen her take. I found her camera lying on the ground near the old trading post foundation. The lens was cracked, but Jaylyn was gone. I searched for an hour, calling her name, checking every building, every collapsed structure. Nothing. I called 911. Search and rescue arrived within 2 hours. They searched for 2 weeks. They brought in dogs, helicopters, ground-penetrating radar. They searched the cave system, the canyon, the surrounding desert. They found nothing. No trace of Jaylyn. No footprints leading away from the site. No signs of struggle, no blood, no evidence of foul play. She had simply vanished. The police interviewed me multiple times. They asked if we had fought. I told them about our argument. They asked if I had hurt her. I told them no. They asked if she might have wandered off and gotten lost in the canyon. I told them she was too experienced for that. They asked if she might have run away. I told them she had no reason to. Eventually, they classified it as a missing person case and the active search ended. But they never found her. I went back to Two Guns 3 times after she disappeared. Always during daylight. Always staying outside the ruins. I was looking for any sign of what happened to her. On my 3rd visit, I downloaded the photographs from Jaylyn's damaged camera. Most of them were normal. Pictures of the ruins, the buildings, the old structures. But the last 6 photographs were wrong. They were taken inside the small chamber in the cave, the one where Jaylyn had zoned out. The photographs showed the walls covered in pictographs, ancient drawings of figures and symbols. But in the background of each photograph, partially hidden in the shadows, there was something else. A shape, dark and indistinct, but unmistakably present. And it was getting closer in each successive photograph. The first image showed it far back in the darkness. The second image showed it a few feet closer. By the 6th image, it was right behind where Jaylyn would have been standing, right behind her. And the angle of the 6th photograph was wrong. It was not taken from Jaylyn's eye level. It was taken from ground level, pointing up, as if the camera had been dropped or placed on the floor. The timestamp on the photograph showed they were taken in a span of less than 2 minutes. The same 2 minutes when Jaylyn had been unresponsive, when she had been speaking in a language I did not recognize. I showed the photographs to the police. They said the shapes were just shadows and tricks of light. They said there was no evidence of foul play. I showed them to paranormal investigators. They said the cave was a place of extreme negative energy, that the massacre had left a spiritual wound that never healed. They said Jaylyn had disturbed something that should not have been disturbed, and that whatever was in that cave had taken her. I do not know what to believe. I do not know if Jaylyn is dead or if she is somewhere else, somewhere the search teams could not reach. I do not know if she was taken by something supernatural or if she wandered off and died in the desert and her body just has not been found yet. But I know the curse of Two Guns is real. I know that place is poisoned by the violence that happened there. And I know that I will never go back. The ruins are still there. The cave is still there. And whatever took Jaylyn is still there too, waiting in the darkness for the next person who ignores the warnings and ventures too deep into a place that should have been sealed forever. Two Guns has claimed dozens of lives over the past century and a half. Business owners, tourists, workers, explorers, and now it has claimed Jaylyn. I hope she found peace, but I do not think she did, because places like Two Guns do not offer peace. They only offer darkness, and once that darkness touches you, it never lets go. I stayed on campus at Northern Arizona University during winter break of my freshman year, because going home to Yuma was not an option. My family had moved to Texas over the summer, and I could not afford a plane ticket. Big mistake. I should have known better than to be alone in Morton Hall. Northern Arizona University sits at 7,000 feet elevation in Flagstaff, surrounded by the largest ponderosa pine forest in North America. The campus is beautiful, with historic buildings dating back to the early 1900s when it was Arizona State Teachers College. Morton Hall is one of those historic buildings. It opened in 1927 as a women's dormitory, and for almost a century it has housed female students in its 4 floors of aging rooms and narrow hallways. The building has character. High ceilings, hardwood floors, radiator heating that clangs and hisses all night long, and windows that do not quite seal properly, so cold air leaks in during winter. But Morton Hall also has a reputation, a dark one. Everyone who lives there knows about Kathy. The legend goes like this. In the early 1950s, a freshman student named Kathy was staying in Morton Hall. She was from a small town in southern Arizona, the first person in her family to attend college. She had a boyfriend back home who was serving in the Korean War. Over Christmas break of her first year, she received two pieces of devastating news. First, her boyfriend was killed in action. Second, her family told her they could no longer afford to pay for her tuition and she would have to withdraw from school. Kathy was alone in Morton Hall during break, one of only a handful of students who had stayed on campus. On New Year's Eve of 1952, she hanged herself in the stairwell between the second and third floors. Her body was not discovered until January 2nd when other students started returning from break. Since then, Kathy has never left Morton Hall. Students report seeing her in the stairwell where she died. They report hearing crying coming from empty rooms. They report feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness and despair in certain areas of the building, particularly on the second floor where Kathy's room was located. And the activity is always worst during winter break, the anniversary of her death, when the building is mostly empty and the few students who remain are alone with whatever still walks those hallways. I moved into Morton Hall in August of 2019. My room was on the third floor, a small single with barely enough space for a twin bed, a desk, and a dresser. The building was old but charming, and I liked the history of it. My RA, Taylin, was a junior who had lived in Morton Hall for 2 years. During our first floor meeting, she told us about Kathy. Not as a warning, more as a fun ghost story to tell new students. She said some people experienced things and some people did not. She said if you were respectful and did not go looking for trouble, Kathy would leave you alone. I believed her. For the first semester, I never experienced anything unusual. Morton Hall felt like any other old dorm, creaky and cold and full of the normal sounds of students living their lives. But when winter break came and most students left campus, everything changed. I was one of 5 students who stayed in Morton Hall over break. The building had capacity for 200 students, so being one of 5 people in all that empty space felt wrong from the very beginning. The first few days were fine. I had the third floor almost entirely to myself. It was quiet, which was nice after the constant noise of a full dorm. I spent my time studying for next semester's classes, watching movies on my laptop, and making trips to the dining hall that stayed open for students who remained on campus. But on the 4th day, December 23rd, things started happening. I was in my room around 10 o'clock at night when my television turned on by itself, just flickered to life with no input from me. I was across the room at my desk, and the remote was on my nightstand. I turned it off and went back to studying. An hour later, it turned on again. This time I unplugged it. The next morning, I woke up to find the poster on my wall had fallen down, not torn or damaged. The thumbtacks were still in the wall. The poster was just lying on the floor like someone had carefully taken it down and placed it there. I hung it back up. That afternoon, it fell again. I told myself it was probably because the walls were old plaster and the thumbtacks were not holding properly. But I knew that was not true. The tacks were firmly in the wall. Something else was taking the poster down. On Christmas Eve, I went down to the second floor to visit one of the other students who had stayed, a girl named Indiana who I had met at the dining hall. Her room was on the opposite end of the building from the stairwell. We were hanging out in her room watching a movie when we heard it. Footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, walking from one end of the corridor to the other. We muted the movie and listened. The footsteps passed by Indiana's door and continued down the hallway. We looked at each other. Indiana said maybe it was one of the other students, but there were only 5 of us in the entire building, and we knew where everyone's rooms were. The footsteps were coming from the wrong end of the hallway, the end where all the rooms were empty. We opened the door and looked out. The hallway was empty. The lights were on, fluorescent bulbs humming overhead, illuminating every corner. No one was there, but we could still hear the footsteps. They had reached the end of the hallway and turned into the stairwell. We heard them going up the stairs. Indiana looked at me and said we should follow them. I thought that was a terrible idea, but she was already moving toward the stairwell. We entered the stairwell and looked up. The footsteps had stopped. The stairwell was silent, and then we heard breathing, slow and labored, coming from above us, from the landing between the second and third floors, the landing where Kathy had hanged herself. Indiana started to climb the stairs, and I followed because I did not want to be alone. We reached the landing and stopped. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees. I could see my breath, and then I saw her. Not clearly. Not like seeing a living person, but a dark shape hanging in the air where a body would hang from a rope. The outline of a woman with her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her feet dangling a few inches off the ground. She was there for maybe 3 seconds, and then she was gone. The temperature returned to normal. The breathing stopped. Indiana and I ran. We ran back to her room and locked the door, and we did not leave until the next morning. Christmas Day was quiet. Too quiet. I stayed in my room most of the day, and I did not hear any unusual sounds. But that night, things escalated. I was in bed trying to sleep when I felt my blankets being pulled off me. Not dramatically, just a slow, steady pull like someone was carefully removing them. I grabbed the blankets and pulled them back. The pulling stopped. I tried to go back to sleep. 10 minutes later, it happened again. This time, I turned on my light and sat up. My room was empty, but I could feel a presence. That unmistakable sensation of being watched by something you cannot see. I got out of bed and turned on every light in my room. I pushed my desk chair against the door, even though it was already locked, and I sat on my bed with my back against the wall, watching the door until the sun came up. I did not sleep at all that night. The next morning, I found scratch marks on my door. 3 parallel lines carved into the wood on the inside, like someone had dragged their fingernails down the surface. The marks had not been there the night before. I would have noticed them. I went to find Talon. She was staying in a single on the first floor, the only RA who had remained on campus during break. I told her everything that had been happening. The television turning on, the poster falling, the footsteps, the figure in the stairwell, the blankets being pulled off, the scratch marks. She did not seem surprised. She said the activity always got worse during winter break. She said Kathy was most active during the period between Christmas and New Year's, the days leading up to the anniversary of her death. Talon asked me if I wanted to move to a different room, maybe down to the first floor closer to where she was staying. I said yes. We moved my things that afternoon. The new room was smaller and darker, but it felt safer being on the first floor. That night, December 26th, all 5 of us who had stayed in Morton Hall experienced something. Indiana texted me at 2 a.m. saying someone was banging on her door, but when she looked through the peephole, no one was there. Another student reported hearing crying coming from the walls. Talon said her doorknob was turning back and forth for 10 minutes straight, even though the door was locked and no one was in the hallway. And in my new first-floor room, I woke up to find I was not alone. There was someone standing at the foot of my bed, a woman in a white nightgown with long, dark hair covering her face. She was not moving, not making any sound, just standing there. I could not scream. I could not move. I just lay there frozen, staring at her. And then she lifted her head, and I saw her face, or what should have been her face. There was nothing there, just darkness where her features should be. She reached toward me with one hand, and that is when I found my voice. I screamed. The figure disappeared. My door burst open and Talon ran in, turning on the lights, asking what happened. I could barely speak. I just pointed to where the figure had been standing. Talon sat with me for the rest of the night. She said we needed to leave. She said the activity had never been this intense before, and staying in Morton Hall was not safe. The next morning, December 27th, all 5 of us packed our things and left. We stayed in a hotel in downtown Flagstaff for the remaining days of winter break, sharing rooms and splitting the cost. We did not go back to Morton Hall until other students started returning for spring semester. When I got back to my 3rd floor room on January 15th, everything looked normal, but my poster, the one that kept falling, was on the floor again. And there was something new, writing on my mirror, written in what looked like condensation, the kind you get when a bathroom mirror fogs up. 3 words. "Stay away, Kathy." I took a picture of it and showed it to Talon. She did not have an explanation. I requested a room transfer that day. The university moved me to a different dorm at the end of January. I never slept in Morton Hall again, but Indiana stayed. She said she had gotten used to the activity, and it did not bother her anymore. 2 weeks into spring semester, she knocked on my door at my new dorm. She said she needed to tell me something. She said on New Year's Eve, the anniversary of Kathy's death, she had been alone in her room when she heard a knock on her door. She opened it and found a note slid under the door, written in old-fashioned handwriting on yellowed paper. The note said, "Thank you for keeping me company. I'm not alone anymore." Indiana said she did not understand what it meant until she started researching Kathy's story more thoroughly. She found old newspaper articles about the suicide, and she found something that most versions of the legend leave out. Kathy had not been completely alone in Morton Hall when she died. There had been one other student staying in the building over break, a girl from Kathy's floor who had found her body in the stairwell. That girl's name was Indiana, the same name as my friend. Indiana told me she thinks Kathy was reaching out to her specifically because of the name connection, some kind of spiritual link across decades. She said the activity stopped completely after New Year's Eve. No more footsteps, no more crying, no more figures in the stairwell. Like Kathy had gotten whatever closure she needed and finally moved on. I wanted to believe that, but I did not, because Morton Hall did not stop being haunted. Other students continued to report experiences throughout spring semester. The building was just as active as it had always been. Whatever happened on New Year's Eve did not release Kathy. It just shifted her attention away from us, the 5 students who had stayed over winter break. I transferred to Arizona State University in Phoenix for my sophomore year. I could not stay at NAU. I could not walk past Morton Hall without remembering that figure at the foot of my bed, the emptiness where her face should have been, the way she reached for me. Morton Hall is still in operation. It still houses female students, and Kathy is still there, still walking the hallways, still appearing in the stairwell on the anniversary of her death, still reaching out to students who stay during winter break, looking for company in her eternal loneliness. I hope she finds peace someday, but I do not think she will, because places like Morton Hall hold on to their ghosts too tightly, and ghosts like Kathy hold on right back. My family has lived in the Eagle Creek Valley in southeastern Arizona for 5 generations. We do not talk about the red ghost anymore, but in 2023, I found proof it was real, and I wish I had not. Eagle Creek sits in Graham County, near the New Mexico border, surrounded by desert and mountains, and not much else. The closest town of any size is Clifton, about 20 miles west. My family has ranched this land since 1896, raising cattle and horses on property that stretches across 3,000 acres of high desert grassland. We are not wealthy, but we are established. Our roots go deep, and those roots have stories wrapped around them. Dark stories that most families would have written down or preserved, but that we deliberately chose to forget. The Red Ghost is one of those stories. It was treated as folklore when I was growing up, a campfire tale my grandfather Dion would tell on rare occasions, usually after too much whiskey. A creature that appeared in the Eagle Creek area in 1883. A massive beast, red as hellfire, that trampled a woman to death near the creek and destroyed a prospector's camp near Clifton. Described as some kind of camel or demon, always seen at night, always leaving massive tracks and coarse red hair behind, and always ridden by a corpse strapped to its back. The legend said it was seen dozens of times over a span of years before finally disappearing into history. Most people who know the story assume it was just a feral camel left over from the Army's failed Camel Corps experiment in the 1850s. But my family knew better. We knew it was not a camel. We knew it was something else. And we knew my great-great-grandfather saw it. Grandfather Dayon died in March of 2023 at the age of 96. He spent his final years living in the old ranch house where he had been born, refusing to move into town despite his declining health. When he passed, I was named executor of his estate, which meant going through decades of accumulated belongings and deciding what to keep and what to sell or donate. The main house was full of the expected things: furniture, photographs, old ranch equipment. But the barn was different. The barn had always been off limits when I was growing up. Grandfather Dion kept it padlocked and would get angry if any of us kids went near it. He said it contained dangerous equipment and chemicals, and we had no business being in there. After he died, I finally had a reason to open it. The barn was not full of equipment. It was full of journals, documents, and a large wooden trunk locked with a heavy chain. I spent 2 days going through the journals. They dated back to 1882 and belonged to my great-great-grandfather Daniel Reeves, the first member of our family to settle in Eagle Creek. Most entries were mundane: weather observations, cattle counts, notes about fence repairs and water sources. But then I reached the entries from October 1883 and everything changed. Daniel wrote about hearing screams in the night, animal screams that did not match any creature he knew. He wrote about finding massive tracks near the creek, cloven hoof prints that were twice the size of any horse or cow. He wrote about losing cattle, finding them trampled and partially eaten in ways that suggested a predator with the strength of a grizzly bear. And then he wrote about seeing it. On the night of October 21st, 1883, Daniel was checking his livestock when he saw something moving along the ridgeline about a quarter-mile from his property. He wrote that it was massive, standing at least 8 feet tall at the shoulder, with a long neck and a humped back. And it was red. Not brown, not gray. Red like fresh blood in moonlight. He watched it through his rifle scope for several minutes before it moved behind a rock formation and disappeared. But before it did, he saw something else. There was something on its back, a shape that looked like a human figure, but wrong. Slumped forward, arms hanging loose, head rolling with each movement of the creature beneath it. Daniel wrote that he knew immediately it was a corpse, a body strapped or tied to the creature's back, either as some kind of macabre cargo or as punishment for something the dead person had done. He did not investigate further. He went back to his house, locked the doors, and prayed it would not come onto his property. It did come onto his property. 3 nights later, Daniel heard his horses screaming in the corral and went outside with his rifle. The creature was standing 30 feet from his porch, illuminated by the full moon. He described it in detail: massive cloven hooves, legs like tree trunks, a body covered in coarse hair that glowed red in the moonlight, a long neck ending in a head that was wrong, too large, too angular, with eyes that reflected light like a cat's eyes, glowing yellow and inhuman. And on its back, secured with ropes and leather straps, was the mummified corpse of a man. The body was ancient, desiccated, blackened by sun and time. The clothes were rotted away to rags, but the most disturbing detail was the position. The corpse was facing backward, its head hanging down, its empty eye sockets staring at anyone who might follow. Daniel raised his rifle and fired. He hit the creature in the shoulder. It made a sound he described as something between a scream and a roar, a noise that made his bones vibrate and his ears ring. And then it charged. Daniel fired again and again, emptying his rifle, but the creature did not fall. It smashed through his fence, trampled his vegetable garden, and disappeared into the darkness. In the morning, Daniel found massive tracks leading away from his property. He also found blood, thick, dark blood that had a chemical smell to it, like sulfur or copper. And he found hair, coarse red hair that was warm to the touch, even hours after the creature had fled. Daniel's journal entries became increasingly frightened after that night. He wrote about seeing the creature in the distance multiple times over the next few months. He wrote about other ranchers and prospectors reporting sightings. He wrote about a woman being trampled to death near Eagle Creek in November 1883, and he wrote about the corpse on the creature's back. He became convinced it was not random cargo. It was a specific person, someone who had committed some transgression that resulted in being bound to the creature as eternal punishment. Daniel theorized that the creature was not natural, that it was some kind of spirit or demon tied to the land, cursed to wander forever carrying its burden. The last entry about the red ghost was dated April 1884. Daniel wrote that he had not seen the creature in over a month and hoped it had moved on. But then he added something that made my blood run cold. He wrote, "I killed it yesterday. Shot it at close range and it finally fell. I cut the corpse from its back and burned it. I took the hide as proof, hidden in the barn where no one will ever find it. May God forgive me for what I have kept." I reread that passage 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly. Daniel had killed the red ghost. He had kept its hide, hidden in the barn. I looked at the locked trunk sitting in the corner. I knew what was inside. I did not want to open it, but I had to. The chain was rusty, but the lock was still solid. I had to cut it with bolt cutters. When I opened the trunk, the smell hit me first. Old leather and dust and something else underneath. Something organic that had rotted and dried over more than a century. Inside was a hide. A massive animal hide, folded carefully and wrapped in oilcloth to preserve it. I unfolded it slowly. The hide was roughly 12 feet long from end to end and 6 feet wide, covered in coarse hair that was still red even after all these years, though darker now, more rust-colored than blood-colored. The hair was unlike anything I had ever seen, thick and wiry, more like quills than fur, and the shape was wrong. The hide did not match any known animal. The proportions were off. The skull was too large and angular. There were holes in the hide where Daniel's bullets had struck, and along one edge were marks that looked like they had been made by ropes or straps, deep grooves worn into the leather over time. This was not a camel. This was not any animal I could identify. I did not know what to do. I could not show this to anyone without looking insane. So I did what any rational person would do in 2023. I took samples, small pieces of the hide and hair that I could send to a university laboratory for DNA analysis without revealing where they came from. I submitted them under a false name, claiming I found them in my attic and wanted to identify what animal they belonged to. The results came back 6 weeks later, unable to classify, no match to any known animal species living or extinct. The DNA showed characteristics of multiple species, primarily camelid and bovine, but with sequences that did not match anything in the database. The lab technician who processed the sample called me personally. He said the sample was contaminated or degraded, that the readings made no sense, and that I should send more material if I wanted accurate results. He also said something else. He said based on the cellular structure and degradation patterns, the sample appeared to be approximately 140 years old, which matched the timeline of when Daniel killed the creature. And then he said I should destroy whatever I found. He would not explain why. He just said some things are better left unknown, and this was one of them. Then he hung up. I should have listened to him. I should have burned the hide and forgotten about it. But I did not. I kept it. I wrapped it back up and locked it in the trunk and put the trunk back in the barn. And then things started happening. I started seeing something on the property at night. Something large and red, always at the edge of my vision, always just beyond the range of my flashlight. I started finding tracks again. The same massive cloven hoofprints my great-great-grandfather described, always appearing overnight, always leading toward the barn and then stopping, like something was coming back to reclaim what had been taken from it. My cattle started acting strange, refusing to go near certain areas of the property, clustering together at night like they were protecting each other from a predator. And I started having dreams. The same dream every night. I am standing in the desert, and something is walking toward me from the darkness. Something massive and red with glowing yellow eyes, and on its back is a corpse. But now I can see its face, and the face is mine. I do not know what the red ghost was. I do not know if it was a cryptid, some unknown species that existed in the 1800s and is now extinct, or if it was something supernatural, something that should not have existed at all. But I know it was real. I have its hide. I have the DNA results. I have my great-great-grandfather's journal describing it in detail, and I know that it is coming back. Or something connected to it is coming back. I am moving off the ranch next month. Selling the property. I cannot stay here anymore. I cannot sleep knowing that thing is out there in the darkness, looking for what was taken from it. The hide will go with me. I cannot leave it behind for someone else to find, but I also cannot destroy it. No, because what if destroying it makes things worse? What if the hide is the only thing keeping whatever that creature was from fully returning? So I will carry this burden, just like my great-great-grandfather carried it, just like the corpse on the red ghost's back carried whatever curse bound it to that creature. We all carry our family's sins. Some of us just carry them more literally than others. If you ever find yourself in southeastern Arizona near Eagle Creek, and you see something red moving in the distance at night, do not investigate. Do not go closer. Just leave, because the red ghost never really disappeared. It is still out there, still waiting, and now it knows where I am.